Welcome to Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and welcome back to 2022. I would say Happy New Year, but we're already in February, so it's been quite a long January for us, but we are back, and Alan Dowd is back with us again. Welcome back, Alan.
Hi, Joy. Good to be here.
Good. Did you have a good New Year?
Thank you. Happy New Year and happy President's Day or
yes,
Valentine's.
And all the ones we have missed in between.
That's right. Valentine's Day next week.
And I think you also mentioned offline Reagan's birthday, which is very important to the American Security Council Foundation.
That's right. I think it's the 6th.
Excellent. Well, we are back to talk about Alan Dowd, our senior fellow here at the American Security Council Foundation's latest, well, I don't want to say latest article because we did put it out in January, but NATO must firmly reject Putin's demands, which is very timely. So, Alan, let's dive into that. And I guess where we're at right now, Putin is calling on the U.S. and NATO to back down from the Ukraine and most of Eastern Europe. But it appears that the U.S. and NATO are firmly saying no. And
right.
I would say firmly, but Russia does have some leverage because of the oil and gas supplies to many of the NATO nations there.
Yeah.
And in your article, you discussed keeping NATO strong and open. In your opinion, how far do you think the U.S. should go in defending NATO nations and stabilizing Europe?
Well, in defending NATO nations, we should go as far as we have to go, and that would be all the way up to and including going to war, because we're committed to them under the North Atlantic Treaty. An attack against one is an attack against all.
Mm-hmm.
So that piece of the discussion is seems to me to be very cut and dried, and pleasantly, maybe it's not surprisingly, but I guess it is surprising to me given the way sometimes NATO's 30 nations don't always stay on the same page. In the case of beefing up, bolstering the defenses of the Balts, Poland, Czech Republic, all the way down to Romania and Bulgaria, NATO has really responded pretty forcefully in beefing up some key areas and key parts of the easternmost flank of NATO. So that seems to me, short answer to that question is it's the United States must and it's clearly ready to go to the ultimate if it has to defend NATO. Ukraine is a different issue, but Ukraine is the core of this crisis. That's a different issue, and we can talk about that if you want.
Yes, it is at the core, and it's a very hot topic, obviously. We don't know at any time Putin could decide to invade.
Right.
And as I said earlier, oil and gas supply is an issue. And recently, the Biden administration did say that if Russia does decide to attack the Ukraine, they are going to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I would say. Do you think that will affect relations with the U.S. and Germany?
I think it would. There were good indications. Chancellor Scholz came over and met with the president earlier this week. We're talking on February 10th right now. 10th is when this is being recorded. He was here earlier this week. So, President Biden made clear that if Russia further invades Ukraine, that Nord Stream is not going to happen. It's important to note Nord Stream 2 could happen. It's been ready to go for months, but Germany's regulatory agencies, I don't know what exactly which ones or how many of them have not given it the final go-ahead. I think that's largely because of Putin's behavior. And Scholz said yesterday or earlier this week that they stand with the U.S. He didn't contradict the president, so that's a good sign that the Germans would do that. That will be a hit for the Germans, though, and for some in Western Europe, because as much as 40% of natural gas flows, that Nord Stream 2 could account for that when it's fully online. Which is why many of us, I've written about it in American Security Council Foundation reports for years. us at ASCF have advocated stronger energy ties between Europe and the U.S. The U.S. has expressed a willingness to try to get liquid natural gas systems flowing from the U.S. and to Southern Europe and Northern Europe, which would kind of wean the Europeans off of Russian dependence. That's a big card that Russia holds, and that's the premise of your question.
Yes, it is.
But as 8 years ago, we were writing about this American Security Council. Even before the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, I wrote some pieces about the dependence of Western Europe on Russian natural gas, and it's a huge security issue. And NATO has said that to countries like Germany, and Germany is not quick to act.
No, I know they're not. Well, and you are one step ahead of me on that, actually, by answering those questions as far as should the U.S. be prepared to offer oil and gas supplies to these NATO nations in case Russia would decide to cut them off, as they have done in the past.
Yeah, we should be prepared. We could have been more prepared, but every to dance you have to have a partner, and not the biggest country in Europe. The biggest economy in Europe is Germany, and they didn't want us to move forward on that. And now we have an administration that is backing off from a lot of the energy independent steps that the Trump administration had taken with strong bipartisan backing. Elections have consequences. President Biden doesn't have the same view, and so now it's going to be a lot harder. In fact, I would submit, Joy, it'd be virtually impossible if Russia all of a sudden tomorrow morning invaded Ukraine and then shut off the natural gas flows into Western Europe. In the dead of winter, we couldn't get the quantities of LNG there fast enough. It could be done, but the systems just aren't in place. There have been talk of having pipelines go through the Mediterranean and through Turkey and things. Turkey's a NATO member, but you can't build those things overnight. By the way, Russia has shut down natural gas pipelines into Ukraine in the dead of winter before. So
yes, that's what I was speaking to. Yes.
Yep. So I wouldn't put it past them to do that. Putin.
And I guess when I said about the U.S., how far we would go in defending NATO, you're absolutely right on the cut and dry part as far as, yes, we're there to back them according to the articles.
Right.
Maybe I should speak more to how far the U.S. would go in defending the Ukraine because they're not a NATO nation.
Right. Well, the thing I think about that in Ukraine is we have 30 members of NATO, and there's a huge number of different kinds of threat perceptions, different kinds of fears, different kinds of capabilities. They run the gamut. They are 30 independent countries. And so there's very hawkish members, there's very dovish members, there's very prepared members, there's very unprepared members. There's also members who distrust Russia deeply. And I would submit, Joy, the further east you go in NATO, the less they trust Russia because they have, wait for it, an experience with dealing with Moscow that Western Europe doesn't have. And I would say that those easternmost members are doing a great service to NATO by helping educate the rest of NATO about what kinds of threat that we're dealing with in the case of Putin. Poland, the Baltics, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they understand that firsthand. All that is to say, there's all these different views, but I would say that no matter the threat perception, all of them seem to agree in the notion that Ukraine, even though it's not a member of NATO, and U.S. boys and girls and the rest of NATO's troops shouldn't be dying and fighting for Ukraine. All of them do agree with the idea that NATO's security, NATO's independence, NATO's long-term security and Europe's stability is better served by Ukraine being an independent democratic country and NATO's security, stability, Europe's long-term stability is going to be jeopardized if Ukraine becomes a Russian vassal state. So if they all agree on that, then we have to start to think about what are the ways that we can democratically oriented Ukraine. And I think that the many NATO allies are doing that. The Americans, the Brits, the Balts, the Poles, the French, I believe Spain and Turkey as well, are putting defensive weapons into Ukraine. There are some number of U.S. troops there, very small number, not even a tripwire force, and certainly not a combat force, but U.S. troops training, British troops training Ukrainian forces on these weaponry. The Turks just signed a deal with Ukraine to allow the Ukrainians to build and manufacture Turkish attack drones.
Yes,
those
I was just
drones,
reading that.
Yeah, those drones, Turkish-built ones, have already been deployed and are being flown by the Ukrainian military. So those are some of the things. Anti-tank missiles that the Brits and the Americans have sent, anti-aircraft systems that the Balts, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania sent, some cyber defenses, I think, which are very important. I know you've talked about that before, Joy, have been, and some cyber partnerships have been built. Ukraine's been the victim of Russian cyber attacks many times the last 15 years.
You actually just led into my second question. Well,
oh, good.
More than second question, I guess.
Before
but
you get to well,
go
before
ahead,
you
finish.
get to that, so those are some of the things that NATO is doing, and I think I don't, I only have access to open source materials. I read a lot of those materials. I can't get into Vladimir Putin's head, but I do know this about Russian leaders in general. They respect strength. Churchill said that there is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there's nothing for they have less respect than weakness. This has been true of Russian leaders, Soviet leaders during the Cold War, Russian leaders before the communists took over, and it's certainly true of Putin. So you have to meet strength with strength. I can't get into his head, but I have to think that he's a bit surprised by this reaction to his diktat that he kind of issued in December when he handed over a proposed treaty. And one thing I would add to your lead-in questions at the beginning, before we get to your thing about cyber, is it's not just that Putin in this treaty, this proposed treaty, he shoved in front of U.S. and our NATO allies' faces in December and demanded it in 30 days a response. It wasn't just that he was saying, I don't want Ukraine, I want you to agree never to allow Ukraine into NATO. He also said, I want you to agree that you will cease all military activity in Eastern Europe and pull back NATO forces to where they were in 1997. By the way, 97 is important because it was in around that time that Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined the alliance. We now have NATO members in the Baltic. So basically what he was demanding was a reversion or a reversal of everything since the end of the Cold War, since 91. All the basically what a lot of us in the foreign policy field call the post-Cold War security structure and architecture of Europe, he wanted totally revised. And I think he was probably surprised that NATO's unified response, no. They immediately said, no, we can't say Ukraine can never join NATO because that means Ukraine is not a sovereign country. NATO has an open door. And no, we can't say that we're going to pull back to where things were in 1997. And we can't cease military activities in Eastern Europe because, wait for it, you're conducting military activities on the borders of our members. So I think that response was good, and I think he might have been surprised by that.
And then your article, that's what you also argue for, keeping NATO open to new member states.
Right. And now is not the time for Ukraine to join NATO, but NATO has an open door. And there's clear indications that Sweden and Finland want to join at some point. Sweden's probably much closer than Finland. NATO recently added what we call Macedonia, what's now officially known as North Macedonia. So NATO has added, I think, 4 members the last 10 years. So it's a living organization. I mean, it's a living, breathing entity, and the door remains open.
Which is definitely a threat to Putin.
In his view, that's right. It shouldn't be. NATO's never attacked Russian or Soviet territory. Russia has attacked 2 NATO aspirants with kinetic force, Georgia and Ukraine. It's attacked multiple NATO nations with cyber attacks. It's now violating British economic activity zone, exclusion zones in the North Sea or around, British waters. Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone. This is stuff that happened during the Cold War. So Putin is the one that's acting aggressively.
Yes.
General Breedlove, who used to be the commander of NATO, now retired American commander of NATO, said, NATO basically tried to hug the bear, his term. And as NATO, the members of NATO, grew more accommodating and more open, he grew more aggressive. And that's just a historical fact.
And his aggression's really what's driving a lot of these nations to want to be part of NATO.
Exactly. That's a great point. And that's the Putin is a smart man. He has a great preternatural sense of weakness, I think, almost like an animal instinct about sensing weakness. He's a smart man, though. And so at some level, he has to understand, unless he wants war, and I don't think he wants war, but he has to understand that it's his actions that have driven other nations closer to or into NATO, Exactly. And in fact, it's his actions that justify what many of us had said in 1989, 90, 91, which was when others, both in the United States and in Russia or the dying Soviet Union, said, well, there's no need for NATO anymore. We said, wait a minute, this is going to be an important insurance policy. NATO's not going to act aggressively, but it's going to be an insurance policy. And the last 14 years since the invasion of Georgia validate that.
Mm-hmm. And now I'm going to get into my second question about what you have mentioned earlier there, the cyber security attacks, specifically in the Ukraine. He's hitting, and I believe, and I would like your opinion on how vulnerable you think the Ukraine is to cybersecurity attacks on their infrastructure and military.
I think the short answer is very, but the longer answer is less vulnerable than they were a year ago or 2 years ago. NATO has helped Ukraine. Individual members of NATO, when you say NATO is doing something, that is generally means some mix of members of NATO are doing something. Right. NATO at large doesn't. All 30 members don't just do something. First off, it's very unwieldy. Second off, each member, which is one of the great things of the alliance, has different niche competencies or abilities. And in the case of cyber, Estonia is one of them, partly because they were attacked so brutally and effectively during what some people call Web War I, and that was in 2007. Russia really went after Estonia, all based on something related to a World War II era statue related to a Soviet soldier or a Soviet monument in Estonia. But Russia went after them cyber-wise and really taught them a lesson, and they became very much an important and effective leader in cyber defense. So they're working with the Ukrainians. The Americans are as well. The U.S. National Security Council spokesman the other day said, we're going to provide Ukraine with, his words, whatever support it needs to recover from a cyber attack. But as you know, Joy, and any of us who have been cut offline even briefly know, or any of us who were affected by the gasoline shortages last May and June, remember, recovering from cyber attack is different than trying to prevent it or beef yourself up against it. And it's much better to shield yourself from that. But I would say that they're vulnerable to cyber attack. Ukraine recently tried about a year or two ago, sought to join NATO's Cyber Defense Center, which is based in Estonia. Hasn't been granted full membership. There are some non-NATO members that are in it right now, so that I think that would help. I don't know if NATO will expedite that right now or not. If they would, it seems like December or January they could have. I haven't read anything about that. But there are a number of things that NATO members, especially Estonia, United States, Britain, have done to try to strengthen Ukraine's cyber defenses. But I think that will be part of Russia's attack. It's not just going to be a multi-directional attack. It'll be a multi-theater, a multi-dimensional, if you will, attack. And it will, it could be very, if it happens, and we're hoping and praying it doesn't. And a lot of NATO members are doing things to try to prevent that. A lot of good diplomacy happening too. But if it happens, it will be devastating to them, well beyond the realm of cyber.
Yeah, and you actually were leading into my next question as far as cyber is concerned, and if he were to take out infrastructure or military or both and leave them vulnerable, it would be a good time for him to possibly come in conventionally and attack.
I think that would be the first wave of an attack. I read a study by RAND, U.S. research firm, several years ago. They said that cyber will become, this was in the 90s when they wrote this, will become the equivalent of the leading edge of a tank attack or the leading edge of an air attack. Cyber will always come before that, some type of cyber event, as the world gets more and more dependent, which makes sense. But it becomes, if you think about it, Joy, warfare becomes much less limited, right? And it becomes much more limited. The United States has taken great pains, spends a lot of money, and so do the rest of the Western countries, certainly members of NATO, trying to make weapons more precise, more focused on hitting the target, hitting the enemy, limiting civilian casualties, limiting, even limiting the destruction of non-military facilities. But cyber, in a sense, rolls warfare backwards because it expands the net of attack. And in fact, a lot of times with cyber attacks, you really don't know how expansive the attack's going to be. The person attacking or the entity attacking really doesn't know where the attack will stop. And that's worrisome. And by the way, I would submit if he strikes Ukraine with cyber effects, or he uses one of his, for lack of better terms, front entities to do so, which is what they've done many times. That's what happened against the U.S. The oil gasoline distribution system back in the southeast of the U.S. back in May, June. That I would say that we should be ready. The United States should be ready, and other members of NATO should be ready for simultaneous, cyber events. That would be hostile.
Sense. Yes. Like you said, recovering from it.
Recovering from it is one thing, and we can recover. It'd be easier for us to recover than Ukraine recover, but it's better to be ready. I know a lot of people say the code word or the watchword for cyber war is resiliency, which is kind of like recovering, but it can be more than just disruptive. It can be truly deadly. We had last year, Russian entities attack our energy supply and our food supply. There was a meat packing facility, large, I think it was 1/5 of America's chicken and beef supply was affected by that. So that gets down to, when you're talking about energy and food, that gets down to human life, right? This isn't whether you can log on to your email. This is
we talked about that on another podcast about the meat and also the Colonial Pipeline. So
yeah, exactly. And those were Russian entities, we know, that did that. And he can say and pretend that he had no idea about that. That's as wrong. And I mean, this is a whole nother discussion, Joy, but the principle in international law is things that emanate from your borders, you as a nation state are responsible for. And if you can't control what happens and emanates from your borders, then you're really not a functioning nation state. And so that's why it's correct to say if you harbor terrorists, you're as much a problem as the terrorists, or if you harbor pirates, you're as much a problem as the pirates. And that's why nation states go after states that allow piracy or terrorism to emanate from their borders. The same principle applies in the cyber realm.
And he's certainly allowing that to happen in Russia.
Yes, that's right. So that's definitely going to be a part of this. And if Ukraine was attacked, several government websites were attacked, I think, in January. If that was the leading edge of this or a test, I have no idea. But that did happen.
And I think I've also read a lot about misinformation campaigns coming from them as well into the Ukraine.
Right. And that's something that is part of this, what is called a hybrid warfare, you launch a misinformation campaign. Misinformation is as old as warfare itself, but nowadays it's so sophisticated. You use a video that is you've heard the term deep fake of, it looks like President Zelensky of Ukraine saying, put down your arms or something. And it looks so real, it's impossible to see that it's a fake, those kinds of things, or you use a fake video that's put onto the internet or put onto Russian television or given to CNN or whatever, and it shows what looks to be a Ukrainian soldier doing something terrible to a Russian child or something. Those kinds of things are what concerns people. And even I think the British and American governments raised the alert about that the last 2 weeks, that there's a plan at foot for Russia to do that. People forget the Germans said that with misinformation, said that the Poles had attacked them in 1939, and that's why they had to go to war to start World War II. That was misinformation. There was no truth to that, but that's what happened.
That's a good point, because that's what I was reading about. That supposedly he could make it seem as if that Ukraine had attacked.
Right, and he's just defending exactly, and that's an old trick, and that. He's done, or his entities, his intelligence entities have done things, there were reports over the last few years, before the pandemic even, that implicated U.S. troops based in the Baltics for doing things against people in the Baltics to try to gin up anti-American fervor in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were false, but these things, once you plant those things, they can be pretty destructive. But that's all part of what you're talking about, Joy. Hybrid warfare, misinformation. It's a very sophisticated and multi-layered campaign. And the very fact that he if you think about it, the very fact that he's forced Macron to rush to Moscow to talk to him, and forced the German chancellor to rush to D.C. and he's put everyone on their heels. It's all part of a destabilization effort, and then you put 120,000 troops and 1,200 tanks all around Ukraine's borders, and Poland, by the way, and not Romania, but and Poland's borders and Lithuania's. That's all very unsettling. 140 warships are put in motion. Russia doesn't have, but that's most of their navy, So it's all very destabilizing.
And then I believe my co-host had a question. He's not able to be here with me today, but do we have a Navy ship out in the Mediterranean? Is something we heard.
Well, there's always U.S. and other NATO
carrier
warships out there. Yes, but there are 3 carriers in the Mediterranean, not American. American is one of them, operating in an unusual, and I'm sure not coincidental, big naval operation or exercise. A French carrier, an Italian carrier, and a U.S. aircraft carrier are operating and have been for a few days. The U.S. carrier is, I'm going to check on that. It's the Truman, yeah. And then a French and a Italian carrier with all their related support ships. It's a pretty big flotilla, and it is somewhere in the Mediterranean, the northern Mediterranean. a big body of water, obviously, but it's I know the Truman was near the Adriatic before it linked up with these other two carrier strike groups. But that's an impressive display of force and not coincidental. I think I've mentioned to you guys in other discussions the De Gaulle, the flagship of the French Navy. It's worked very closely with the U.S. Navy, especially during the anti-ISIS operations. It even commanded the naval-borne airstrikes, including U.S. airstrikes, during the height of the anti-ISIS operation. So a lot of interoperability, very close partnership and cooperation between those three allies, and I think probably a pretty strong signal to Russia.
Yes, that is a strong signal, and like you said, impressive. And leading into that, my next question, as we talked about earlier, sending that strong signal is important because Putin respects the strength and looks at weakness. And I would go back to 2014 when Putin went and annexed Crimea. What can we learn from that possibly might give us some signals for what's going on now, or what he might be thinking now? Or was that, in your opinion, a different strategic operation?
Well, one thing we can learn from that, and I think the lessons are being applied, and that is what we talked about, hybrid warfare, fomenting something that's really not real to justify an operation, those kinds of things. I think the allies have their antenna up. In 2014, we didn't have any surveillance planes flying over Ukraine. We do today. U.S. and other NATO planes are flying over Ukraine. I think it was probably not coincidental that a U.S. plane that specializes in looking down to take pictures of ground movements, kind of like an airborne version. It's kind of like a ground-focused version of AWACS called JSTARS. It flew over Ukraine, and then I think pretty purposely the Defense Department let everybody know that it did that, and then it shared some of the information with the world, and hopefully it shared all the information with the Ukrainian government. So those kinds of things we were not doing in 2014. So there probably are some lessons that are applied there. But the idea that the aggressor almost always has the advantage, and especially if he wants to try to foment a crisis or foment some type of thing that would force or allow him to justify or rationalize intervening further. And I'm glad you asked the way you did, Joy. So many of our fellow Americans, even informed citizens, don't know that. And when you hear the term "if Putin invades," it's already happened once. He and his Russian militia, ethnically Russian people who happen to live in Ukraine, armed by Russia, along with Russian troops, occupy a good chunk of eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea. So it's great that you asked the question the right way. But I would say that those are some of the things that we're more prepared for, probably on the cyber front. Probably, I think the fact that we're just sharing with the world the things that we're seeing, we being the U.S. defense and intelligence agencies, is another factor that's important to let the world know and keep our allies informed of just what Putin is up to. And just today, I don't know if you've noticed, almost all the top sections of major newspaper websites is about Russia having a pretty big military movement or exercise or war game in Belarus right now. Yeah. So the worry for Belarus, as you know, Joy, is that it basically allows Putin to cut off a huge amount of distance to get to Kiev. He can just roll right into Kiev instead of, but that could be a feint. He may just want to set up a land bridge connecting what he occupies in eastern Ukraine to Crimea, a land bridge there. And that some people say that's really his goal.
Yeah, I've heard arguments for that too.
Yeah, I think that may be his tactical goal. I think his long-term strategic goal is to make Ukraine so weak or such a vassal state that it is unable to be independent. It is unable to. It won't be truly democratic. He'll install somebody and so it can never really move toward what you and I might call a Western-style liberal democracy, with free markets and economic freedom, political freedom, and in sovereignty. It has been sovereign largely since '91, and he's kind of lopping that off piece by piece.
And you said long-term strategic plan. And when you say long-term, do you believe that he may possibly use this Belarus exercises to leave troops there on the border?
Sure. Yes, I think he could do that, and that's kind of one of the reasons I think NATO has to put together, as I said, I think in that essay that you referenced for American Security Council I wrote back in December. I think that even if he says, okay, I'm a reasonable man, we're not going to invade Ukraine, and I'm a man of peace, but I'm going to leave all these troops here. That's like a sword hanging over, not just Ukraine's head, but also in a sense NATO's head, or you could say Europe's head, because that will affect the stability of Europe. If he invades Ukraine, whether it's this year or next year, or if he just keeps troops there kind of on a war footing, that does not promote stability in Europe, and that's bad for the security of NATO, which then affects the United States. It could cause refugee flows. It could cause governments to teeter. There's a whole bunch of things that could flow from him just keeping troops there in Belarus and masses of troops in what would be Western Russia too.
And Belarus and other the nations there in Europe are already dealing with the immigration issue and refugee problems.
Right.
So.
Well, and that, by the way, Joy, just what you said, it's a great point. That's part of the hybrid war that Russia has waged. Working with Belarus, they let flow into Poland and Ukraine just streams of illegal immigrants using human beings, very sadly, human beings as weapons. Those poor people, those friendless people, were just being used as, it's wrong to say pawns, they're really being used as weapons to try to overwhelm or destabilize those countries that had to take in these refugee flows. I mean, now you've got Poland building walls and big berms and things to protect itself from these refugee flows, which were purposely sent in there by the Belarus and Russian government. Partnering with the Russian government. So.
Well, and here's my last and hypothetical question. So if, and hopefully they don't invade, Russia doesn't invade the Ukraine, but if they were going to, it's been said China has not, the Olympics are going on right now, and they would not want Russia to invade while they have the Olympics going on. Do you think Putin would respect that?
Well, the Georgia invasion happened right smack dab in the middle of the Olympics. So that being said, if he made a deal or a promise to Xi Jinping, I'm sure he'd respect that. But there probably was no such deal made in 28. Like you just said, I've read a lot of things that said if the invasion happens, it'll happen after the Olympics, because China doesn't want that to be a black eye, and that makes sense. There's zero doubt in my mind that they cooperate and they see the world the same way, because they're both tyrant regimes, and they both oppose the existing, we talked about this, world order, which is premised on free governments, free markets, free flow of information and goods, and they also are really bothered by who helped build and who's at the top of that world order, and that is the United States. So they have a lot of shared means and motives, But I agree with your point that they probably have. I'm sure we know they talked, because Putin was there, and there was a big show of them being friendly to each other, and they are partners, if not allies. But I don't know if the Olympics would stop Putin from doing anything, because in 2008 he invaded Georgia.
Yeah, that was my thoughts too. But
yeah,
I'm just interested to know what your
But all that is to say, although our whole 40-minute discussion, Joy, all the ink that's been printed and pixels that have talked about this underscore how destabilizing his actions are and how he has pushed basically everyone back on their heels, and that's exactly what he wants. And I think that's why the United States should lead NATO in trying to put together a longer-term plan to remind him who really holds the cards. Okay, you want to talk about the post-Cold War order? We don't like it either. What we don't like is that you have got troops in Moldova and the Moldovans don't want you there. We don't like that you've got troops in Ukraine and the Ukrainians and the Georgians don't want you there. So what we're going to do is make it very uncomfortable for your troops to be in these places that they're not supposed to be, working with these countries. And let him think about that. You know, you think you hold the cards on energy? Well, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. Now we're building a robust liquid natural gas transatlantic system and trans-Mediterranean system to make sure that no one depends on you for energy. You know, these are some of the things on the economic and the military side that we can do. And you can really, if he wants to invade Ukraine, you've heard the saying, make Ukraine or make Taiwan a porcupine, which is make it so difficult or so painful to invade that you think twice about doing it, and just let him know that we're going to send as many anti-tank weapons, as many anti-personnel weapons, as many anti-air and anti-drone systems as we can that will just make it very painful for you to have men and material inside Ukrainian territory. We don't want to go into Russia. I think Reagan once joked, who would care to have any of it? But I mean, but we're going to make it painful if you push yourself beyond these territories, beyond your borders. And of course, there's financial things too. People talk about getting them out of the SWIFT program, which would be fine. The sanctions that the Biden Biden administration have proposed, if he does invade again, sounds like one of the things they would keep out of Putin's hands would be chips and things that are essential to keeping a modern, economy going. They could start to sanction specific people in his very close inner circle. So those are some things. But these are things that NATO holds many more cards than he does. He plays a very weak hand very well. NATO plays a very strong hand poorly, and we can change that. But it just takes leadership.
Well, I think you summed it up very well as far as your article is concerned right there with what you said. And peace through strength is our motto, and that is a good deterrence if we keep NATO strong.
Well, thank you. Yes, absolutely. And that's NATO is best when it's strongest. And NATO, by the way, is really not designed to fight wars. It's designed to deter and prevent wars. And it was very effective at that because the Soviets understood that the cost of war was going to be far outweighed by what it would gain from fighting such a war. And Russians must need to understand that too.
Yes. Well, thank you, Alan, for joining us again. It was good to have you back.
Enjoyed it as always, Joy.
And I really enjoyed your article. And for our listeners, you can find Alan's article from January on our website at www.ascf.us under Position Papers, the Dowd Report. And thank you for joining us again. I hope that we will be doing a 4-part series on either Ukraine or NATO. That is our plan. So please stay tuned. And please join us again next time as we bring you the stories on protecting our freedoms.